Fashion isn't always just about what you wear. It's a reflection of who you are, where you've been, and even where you're going. A phenomenon that started as the prehistorical wearing of animal skins for survival evolved into a high art, and, for those in the know, a legitimate historical marker. Even for the ones out there who want nothing to do with fashion, I can tell if you're the kind by looking at what you wear. Fashion holds information. And one of the most fascinating ways that fashion speaks to culture? Patterns. From the intricate, delicate designs of the Victorian era to the loud and rebellious ones of the earlier 2000s, patterns have always carried meaning. So let's take a walk through time together and look at the different patterns that have been there when society changed. I'm Cora Poe, and after years of ADD and insomnia, I've studied and wondered about many things. So this is Summer Myth, a place for me to put all that insomnia fuel. Segment 1. The Victorian Era, Opulence and Status. Let's start with the Victorian era, a time when fashion was all about status and excess. Patterns played a huge role in showcasing wealth. Women's dresses featured elaborate floral brocades, damasks, and intricate lace, symbols of elegance and luxury. Because dyes and patterned fabrics were expensive, the more detailed the design, the wealthier you appeared. It was basically 19th century flex culture. Men's fashion of that era for Western civilization was led largely by one of my favorite celebrities of all time, the acclaimed Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde. He was one of the leading enthusiasts of the aesthetic movement. Wilde made its tenets famous across the Western world. In 1882, he embarked on a lecture tour of the United States, promoting aestheticism and becoming a nationwide sensation. He was so inextricably tied to the movement that when Gilbert and Sullivan sought to parody aestheticism in their 1881 operetta, Patience, the leading character was intended to be a parody of Wilde himself. Segment 2. The 1920s. Art Deco and Liberation. Jumping ahead to the 1920s, Art Deco made its mark on fashion as a movement that affected all forms of aesthetics, from architecture to shoes. The geometric patterns we associate with the Roaring Twenties weren't just an aesthetic choice. They represented progress, modernism, and a break from the past. Women were gaining more independence, hemlines were rising, and the bold, symmetrical patterns of the era reflected this newfound freedom. Fashion was no longer just about status, it was about personal expression. There were myriad patterns printed that reflect this era, but hilariously, I find there are two general types that are most common, and I categorize them as follows: goth and Egyptomania. We'll start with the more interesting one. Egyptomania was the term coined to express the trend that swept the Western world by storm. Egypt's independence was declared from Britain in 1922. People of the 1920s, particularly in the UK and the US, were obsessed with Egypt and the ancient sites of Kal Kabir, Giza, and Dendera being excavated at the time. This quickly made its way into fashion, be it in the stylings of those beautiful geometric designs in Art Deco, or the shape of the trendiest women's eyeliner. The appropriation of ancient Egyptian iconography was massively popular. In men's fashion, mostly in the UK and US, golf shaped the masculine fads of the era. This was mostly thanks to Edward, Prince of Wales. Fashionhistory.fitnyc.edu says, he was thought to be the good-looking, well-dressed son of the king, who is often seen at parties in London. He had the reputation of a playboy, but he was also known for his fashion sense, and many men on both sides of the Atlantic aspired to dress like him. End quote. His outfits bore varying prints of plaids and sweater patterns. Segment 3. The 1940s and 1950s. Elegance and icons. The 1940s and 50s saw a return to refined elegance, even when wartime rationing affected fabric production. Polka dots and gingham prints became very popular, often seen in casual and formal wear alike. Hollywood icons like Katharine Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe defined this era's aesthetic with feminine silhouettes and structured designs. Patterns during this time reflected both post-war optimism and the sense of beauty that would become considered classic. The late 40s and 50s post-war approach to dressing inspired a more casual, sporting style for both men and women, which saw popularity in both the US and Europe. Servicemen who returned to mainland US from Asia and the Pacific Islands brought with them a trend for brightly colored Hawaiian shirts. Though they had gained popularity in Hawaii in the 1930s, the trend spread in the post-war years into the 50s, as the relaxed American style was widely enjoyed, and obviously is still to this day. In contrast with that island vibe, the mid to late 1950s saw a rise in the popularity of Italian suits with narrow, striped ties. Menswear gradually incorporated brighter colors and patterns, which often appeared on ties and began to widen as the decade progressed. Segment 4, the 1960s and 1970s, psychedelia and protest. Now let's talk about a pattern revolution, the 60s and 70s. This was an era of cultural upheaval, and fashion patterns reflected that rebellious spirit. Psychedelic swirls and tie-dye and paisley became prints and symbols of counterculture, peace, and protest. These patterns weren't just about standing out and being different. They were a way to reject conformity and embrace a more free-spirited lifestyle. Think Woodstock, think flower power. It was fashion with a message. Like the 20th century pussy hat, many of these patterns were, for the first time, genderless. And specifically for masculine stylings, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and Mick Jagger, among others, became a primary influence on men's fashion. And I'd argue that continues today, as my husband looks fine as hell in some John Lennon glasses. Segment 5, the 1980s and 1990s, maximalism and identity. The 80s and 90s were all about making a statement. Whether it was bold zebra stripes, neon checkerboard prints, or the ever-iconic plaid flannel of the grunge movement, these patterns became tools of self-expression. While the 80s thrived on maximalism and excess, the 90s grunge scene turned into a plaid and muted tones as a rejection of the mainstream culture. Later in the decade, hip-hop and rap gave rise to its own style in the US. Groups such as Run DMC and the Beastie Boys led the way with their New York-inspired looks. Hennessy notes the key aspects of their styles. Quote, "These elements included old-school white trainers by Adidas and Puma, distressed tapered jeans, preppy button-down and polo shirts, nylon coach hats, hooded sweatshirts, gold chains, and baseball caps worn at an angle." End quote. The patterns found in these looks were often bright color blocking, various plaids, and, as mentioned, the famous triple stripes of Adidas. In terms of edgier aesthetics, the desire for vintage clothing encouraged the spread of secondhand clothing stores, which were also used for grunge fashion, a style that emerged in Seattle in the late 1980s. By the early 90s, it was a widespread look that was based on everyday clothing such as a baggy, worn-out pair of jeans, flannel shirts, and combat-style boots. For women, this also included simple slip dresses, often worn with chunky boots like Doc Martens. In 1993, grunge made its way to the catwalk in Marc Jacobs' collection for Perry Ellis. Once again, fashion reflects the times, loud, dark, rebellious, and ever-changing. Segment 6, 2000s, scene kids and emo culture. The early 2000s, I remember them well. I do. A time of questionable fashion choices and a couple of the most visually distinct subcultures, emo and scene. Patterns like bold stripes, checkerboard prints, back from the 80s, and even the infamous raccoon tail hair trend became synonymous with alternative identity. These patterns weren't just about looking edgy, they did symbolize individuality, rebellion, and a deep connection to the internet culture of the time, which was the birth of social media. And let's not forget its immediate tie to the music of the time. Paramore and Bring Me the Horizon pretty much had their own religions at that point. Segment 7, the 2010s, sustainability and simplicity. I can personally attest to the goth and grunge fashions and subsequent patterns of the 80s and 90s confidently making their way all the way through to the early 2000s and then on to the late 2010s, particularly in Seattle. The subcultures of punk, goth, and hipster all grew to demand sustainability as the realities of fast fashion's effect on pollution and climate change became quantifiable. In contrast with the bringing back of patterns and new renditions from all decades, polka dots, pinstripes, gingham, paisley, etc., there came a rise in an appreciation for simplicity, minimalism. Early on in the decade, normcore eschewed the perfectly styled looks of high fashion for a minimalist approach. It also took a stand against fast fashion as capsule wardrobes, which is when all your clothes are simple, high-quality, sustainably made, and interchangeable pieces. These became more and more popular. The solid prints and simple styles were largely the absence of patterns, as many people changed their fashion sense to defy fast fashion with pieces that were timeless. Without patterns, their clothes bore no anchor to history, and they could be reworn without embarrassment for decades. I am personally in the process of consolidating my wardrobe with the same goals. What a mess. Ilchi wrote, "Normcore was meant as the antidote to the overly stylized runways and designer goods. Instead, the trend put an emphasis on mundane, casual looks that historically were interpreted as anything but fashionable." Ironically, I believe that these blander styles had a hand in making an accessible gateway to goth for the masses, as simple all-black ensembles became popular in the subculture, which in turn were simple and easy to repeat for newcomers. Once they were dressed to code, entry to clubs was accepted, and the rest of the subculture could be experienced, meaning our music and unique social habits. I think similarly, black and white or black and red checkered patterns, some plaids, and leather were also the first step in helping quote-unquote normies gain rites of passage into punk scenes of the 80s and post-punk or pop-punk subcultures of the early 2000s as well. And to get on my little soapbox for a second on this, I think that's so great, because the best part about these subcultures is that just beneath the surface, seriously, such a thin layer beneath the surface, you can see how loving, inclusive, consent advocating, and gentle we are. So the more people that we can entrust that legacy to, the better. Segment 8, conclusion. From Victorian luxury to your embarrassing 2000s emo phase, fashion patterns have always been more than just a fabric design. They tell a story. They reveal shifts in society and changing values and cultural movements. So the next time you throw on an outfit that's patterned, it might be fun to think about what those designs have meant throughout time. Fashion is history in motion. If you've enjoyed this little trip through some of history's most iconic patterns and the subcultures that they accentuated, don't forget to like, subscribe, and for more deep dives on this art, make sure you press the notification bell. What's your favorite fashion era? Or your most loathed pattern? Let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching. Happy nightmares.